Good day, people. This discussion of Jared Diamond's classic work, Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Fates of Human Societies. I'm just going to kick it off with the test questions. What was the most important single invention of the last few thousand years? He's going to say writing. According to Jared Diamond, another chain of causation led from food production to writing, possibly the most important single invention of the last few thousand years. Writing has evolved de novo, right, newly, only a few times in human history in areas that had been the earliest sites of the rise of food production in their respective regions. All other societies that have become literate did so by the diffusion of writing systems or of the idea of writing from one of those few primary centers. Hence, for the student of world history, the phenomenon of writing is particularly useful for exploring another important constellation of causes, geography's effect on the ease with which ideas and inventions spread, right? So this idea of writing as a communication technology that allowed certain populations to spread their ideas really became crucial in innovation technology, media, and communication and culture. What kind of tools did Cro-Magnon folk use, right? So Cro-Magnon, that's like 50, 100, 200,000 years ago. So well beyond anything we would sort of take today as technology or media. But they were our ancestors. They were the forerunners, and they figured incredible things out. So here's what Professor Diamond says. He says, tools were produced in diverse and distinctive shapes, so modern that their functions as needles, awls, engraving tools, and so on are obvious to us. Instead of only single-piece tools such as handheld scrapers, multi-piece tools made their appearance. Recognizable multi-piece weapons at Cro-Magnon sites include harpoons, spear throwers, and eventually bows and arrows, the precursors of rifles and other multi-piece modern weapons. Those efficient means of killing at a safe distance permitted the hunting of such dangerous prey as rhinos and elephants, while the invention of rope for nets, lines, and snares allowed the addition of fish and birds to our diet. And so what the argument that he's making here is that you know uh, these men and women, right? The Cro-Magnons, and who knows? I mean, there was like they did not look the way we look today. If you look at the anthropological pictures, right? The skull shape is different, the face, the nose, right? The erect posture is not as straight up. But they figured a lot of really interesting media out, a lot of technology that we are the heirs to. What does Professor Diamond say about Cro-Magnon art? He says of the Cro-Magnon's products that have been preserved, the best known are their artworks, their magnificent cave paintings, statues, and musical instruments, which we still appreciate as art today. Anyone who has experienced firsthand the overwhelming power of the life-size painted bulls and horses in the Lascaux cave of southwestern France will understand at once that their creators must have been as modern in their minds as they were in their skeletons. In the Third Chimpanzee, Jared Diamond argues that what part of the anatomy was primarily responsible for the great leap forward, right? So here, check this out. I mean, he makes this crazy argument that it really had to do with the voice box and the anatomy of our vocal cords, right? So think about media and communication, that really what kind of ripped us out of the sort of what animalistic evolution was the ability to speak, not just calls and cries of the animal world. So here's what he says. He says, obviously, some momentous change took place in our ancestors' capabilities between about 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. That great leap forward poses two major unresolved questions regarding its triggering cause and its geographic location. As for its cause, I argued in my book, The Third chimpanzee for the perfection of the voice box, and hence for the anatomical basis of modern language, on which the exercise of human creativity is so dependent. Others have suggested instead that a change in brain organization around that time without a change in brain size made modern language possible. And perhaps there were, like, because of the stasis of food production, um, and certain benefits of geography and climate, the human anatomy somehow changed. And he's saying it's the voice box that really was responsible for this great leap forward, which made language possible. So he's asking this question about literacy and the Spaniards in relation to the conquest of Mexico, right? And in the fall of the Inca Empire. So, it was kind of like the American Indians coming up against like fairly modern weaponry from Europe, right? Guns and such, and cannons, and right. So, what did literacy give to the Spaniards? Jared Diamond says this. He says, a related factor bringing Spaniards to Peru was the existence of writing. Spain possessed it while the Inca Empire did not. Information could be spread far more widely, more accurately, and in more detail by writing than it could be transmitted by mouth. That information coming back to Spain from Columbus's voyages and from Cortez's conquest of Mexico sent Spaniards pouring into the New World. In short, literacy made the Spaniards heirs to a huge body of knowledge about human behavior and history. By contrast, not only did Atahualpa, he was I guess the emperor of the Inca Empire that got conquered by Pizarro. By contrast, not only did Atahualpa have no conception of the Spaniards themselves and no personal experience of any other invaders from overseas, but he also had not even heard or read of similar threats to anyone else, anywhere else, anytime previous in history. The Gulf of experience encouraged Pizarro to set his trap and Atahualpa to walk into it. And really, what happened, it was, Spain had colonized that whole region. That's why the continent speaks Spanish instead of some other language, and so much of it was exploitation of the culture, in terms of like enslaving the culture and taking away things like precious metals and such. It was not a friendly relationship between Spain and the Inca Empire. What are the major killers throughout history? See, this is very interesting. Remember, his book is called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And what he's going to say is, like, up until medical biology, germs killed people. And we didn't understand what these viruses and bacteria did. So he says this. He says, the major killers of humanity throughout our recent history, smallpox, flu, tuberculosis, malaria, plague, measles, and cholera are infectious diseases that evolve from diseases of animals, even though most of the microbes responsible for their own epidemic illnesses are paradoxically now almost confined to humans. So he's going to say this is a super big deal, because if you come from a culture which raises these animals, you're already going to be predisposed to these diseases. But if not, then it's going to create a plague and kill many, many, many thousands of people. Because diseases have been the biggest killers of people, they have also been decisive shapers of history. Until World War II, more victims of war died of war-borne microbes than of battle wounds. All those military histories glorifying great generals, oversimplifying the ego-deflating truth. The winners of past wars were not always the armies with the best generals and weapons, but were often merely those bearing the nastier germs to transmit to their enemies. And so, I mean, some of these battles were really prolonged, and the idea of what, uh, I don't know if even the plague that would have been created would have been intentional, but if you had raised animals, you would have been already exposed to these germs. And so this is, these are just really good examples of how media and technology affect culture, and how this has been the case since the dawn of history, right? That like these changes in media, right? Moving from our kind of bestial to language through the voice box, right? The ability to speak. And then this incredible breakthrough of writing, and then the printing press, and then, that really led to the Enlightenment and the Renaissance of the 17th, the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. And this is when these people sailed. That's when, quote unquote, America was discovered, even though there aren't any people here. Uh, what was perhaps the most important single step in the whole history of writing? Jared Diamond says this. He says, perhaps the most important single step in the whole history of writing was the Sumerians' introduction of phonetic representation, right? Phonemes, the idea of the alphabet. Initially by writing an abstract noun, which could not be readily drawn as a picture, by means of the sign for a depictable noun that had the same phonetic pronunciation. So something very strange happened, and it's really hard to get your head around. But it was about 2,800 years ago in the area of like Iran, Iraq, the Mediterranean Fertile Crescent. They figured out how to phonetically represent speech through visual symbols. And this radical transformation in how we communicate heightened the use of vision in the eye, in really minimized the ear, right? I mean, reading doesn't so much use the ear, but it really makes for, I mean, it has transformed culture in so many radical ways. Why was writing never developed or even adopted by hunter-gatherer societies? Writing was never developed or even adopted by hunter-gatherer societies because they lacked both the institutional uses of writing and the social and agricultural mechanisms for generating the food surpluses required to feed scribes, right? Remember that, writing only happened, especially like the phonetic alphabet, like maybe 4,000 years ago. The agriculture had to be developed. Nomads, right? The idea of sort of wandering hunter-gatherer society had to end before writing could be developed, is what he's saying. Uh, what are his two main conclusions about technology? He says this, he says, my two main conclusions are that technology develops cumulatively rather than in isolated heroic acts, and that it finds most of its uses after it had been invented, rather than being invented to meet a foreseen need. And that is so interesting because it tells you that, culture and technology is built on the ideas of the past. And so, even though we don't recognize it, we're heirs to this vast accumulation of sort of cultural knowledge and understanding. And right, rather than having like super geniuses transform stuff, I mean, super geniuses are there, there's no doubt about it, but he's sort of minimizing their effect. And then the second part is you don't really know the effects of a technology until after it's invented. That's what he's saying. It's right. It finds most of its uses after its invention, right? So, like that is to say, cultures appropriate technologies as they will, and they're unpredictable and chaotic for that reason. What are the four factors that influence adoption of a technology? The first and most obvious factor is relative economic advantage compared with existing technology, so money. A second consideration is social value and prestige, which can override economic benefit or lack thereof. Status. Still another factor is compatibility with vested interests, right? And this has to do with power. Like, if vested interest, who is the power? Can they quash a new technology if it threatens them, even though it's better? The remaining consideration of affecting acceptance of new technologies is the ease with which their advantages can be observed. Right? So, I mean, what does the new technology do for you? Can you see it? Can you see the benefit? Jared Diamond says because technology begets more technology, the importance of an invention's diffusion potentially exceeds the importance of the original invention. So that has to do with the technology spread through the population. Fanaticism and war emerged when? In human evolution. Naturally, what makes patriotic and religious fanatics such dangerous opponents is not the deaths of the fanatics themselves, but their willingness to accept the deaths of a fraction of their number in order to annihilate or crush their infidel enemy. Fanaticism in war was probably unknown on Earth until chiefdoms and especially states emerged within the last 6,000 years. What does Jared Diamond say about minor cultural distinctions? He says this. A minor cultural feature may arise for trivial, temporary local reasons, become fixed, and then predispose a society toward more important cultural choices, as is suggested by applications of chaos theory to other fields of science. Such cultural processes are among history's wildcards that would tend to make history unpredictable. And so this idea of kind of creating a perfect science is of history, and culture is not going to work because, I mean, preferences and choices and the things that make cultures distinct, they're chaotic and unpredictable.